December 16, 1773, the American colonists had proved they had had it. Late that evening, the colonists masqueraded as Indians and threw 342 crates of tea into the Boston harbor. They were tired of Britain controlling what products, including tea, they could import and sell, so they decided to jettison the products that represented every law the British had put into place against them. The colonists were infuriated with Britain by the time of the Tea Party, so when the Coercive Acts went into effect during that year, it was the final straw for the colonists. They decided that they would not tolerate this anymore because the content of the acts, which included the reinforcement of the Quartering Act and the inauguration of the Boston Port Act, was ridiculous. The Quartering Act, released in March of 1765, stated, "There may be occasion for marching and quartering of regiments and companies of His Majesty's forces in several parts of His Majesty's dominions in America." The Act continues to say that the quartering of the British soldiers must be allowed by the colonists. According to historian Howard Zinn, the Coercive Acts were inappropriately severe. Zinn claims the acts virtually established martial law, meaning that the acts were too extreme for the events during the time, a non-war period. The late 1700s were defined by events that are more characteristic of a kind of revolution, in Zinn's words. Although Zinn says the Coercive Acts were out of place, he does not determine whether they played a significant role in pushing the colonists further away from Britain. It can be inferred further that they did, because the colonists were so infuriated with Britain that they soon broke off from the British entirely, resulting in an outbreak of war. Besides the Quartering Act, another one of the Coercive Acts was the Boston Port Act, released by British Parliament just 3 months after the Tea Party. The act was introduced as an act to discontinue the landing and discharging, lading and shipping of goods, wares, and merchandise at the town and within the harbor of Boston. Historian Edmund S. Morgan sees this act for exactly how it was intended by the British. The blow is aimed at Massachusetts, he writes in The Birth of the Republic. He sees that the Bostonians were martyred because Boston stood foremost in defense of colonial rights. This analysis is validated by a latter section of the Boston Port Act. The Act states, "Dangerous commotions and insurrections have been fomented and raised in the town of Boston, in the province of Massachusetts Bay, and New England by ill-affected persons." Morgan's comments about the Coercive Acts as a whole are spelled out in the text of the Boston Port Act. The pure text of the Boston Port Act alienates the Massachusetts colonists. In many instances, they were attacked and left with nothing but a haste to be rid of the Coercive Acts. Morgan's analysis does not elaborate much further on the subject. Yet, a split from the British government came only 2 years later, so the Coercive Acts definitely were a significant influence in the colonists' desire to break away from Britain. They had no other choice but to be infuriated. When representatives from each colony came together 2 years later in June of 1776 to create what became the Declaration of Independence, it is obvious they could no longer tolerate Britain's restraints on colonial freedom and were ready to split from their mother country. When looking between Zinn and Morgan, a commonality in their analysis of the Coercive Acts is the lack of significance the acts had in the long run of the Revolution. The Coercive Acts, unlike many other regulations put into place by the British Parliament during the late 1700s, did not only create more laws, but they created intolerable laws. It is clear that the restrictions of the Coercive Act signified a major turning point in the relationship between Britain and the American colonies. The Coercive Acts were the laws that made the Americans most frustrated. Therefore, they drove the Americans away the most from the British control. This is undeniable. Yet, an unexplored result of the Coercive Acts stands out. The restrictions of the Coercive Acts were completely underrated by Morgan and Zinn. At the end of the day, the Acts need to be given more credit as a driving force in the separation between Britain and the American colonies.